Thanks, everybody. How we doing? Last session? Ready to go? Woo! Right. Who flew more than 2 hours to get here? All right, most of us. So, okay. So Steve already introduced us a little bit, but why don't you tell them who you are, Mark?
Yeah, just to give you a little bit more context, I'm kind of on the synthetic side of the input into this discussion. So I run SpeedCurve, which is essentially a SaaS offering on top of web page test. So running all that good web page test synthetic in the cloud and providing that trending information over time.
And one of the things I love about Mark is his background is really in design. And those of you who saw the keynote this morning, which was excellent, kind of get a taste for the world that he lives in and how he comes about performance. So very unique and exciting to have the opportunity to speak with him. I'm Cliff. I'm from SOSTA, and I come from the RUM world. I do have a background in synthetic and web performance and all things performance, but most recently the VP of product for a real user measurement product called Impulse here at SOSTA. So we talked a lot about trying to do this talk together, and I think it's sort of interesting. We both flew as far as we could to meet here in Barcelona to do it, but happy to be here and excited to get going. Before we start talking about this, and again, we're going to take it a little bit easy on your brains today, hopefully, and get you thinking a little bit differently, but we also want to just set a framework and really a baseline for this conversation. So I like to think of things in terms of active monitoring. When we talk about active monitoring, what is that? So it's essentially a simulated check where you're actively creating an event or a singular action. Synthetic is a form of that active monitoring. Thinking about scripted journeys to an application, you are actually creating a machine to actually do something that's more of an event-driven type of monitoring versus passive monitoring, where really you're listening, right? You're listening to actual traffic as it moves through that system, observing all the behavior of the system and or its operator. I think this is really sort of where the term measurement comes from. When we think about real user measurement versus real user monitoring, really the same thing, but carries that same message of you're listening, you're measuring something versus creating an action. So RUM is a form of that passive monitoring.
And so the thing that we really wanted to do with this talk is, I guess, elevate the discussion a little bit out of the doldrums of dealing with the technical details. So this is not going to be a talk about the details of how you actually implement RUM and how it all kind of works and how synthetic works. But what we were really interested in is coming at this from a user's perspective. How do we monitor the user experience for actual end users of product? And we sort of extended that out into users within our organization. And so that's the perspective we want to bring. So we're not necessarily looking at other forms of monitoring like uptime monitoring or APM or those sorts of spaces. So really, how can we use this data to create meaning within our organizations?
Absolutely. So a little bit of 101 here. So for those of you who haven't heard of RUM before, which I'm guessing is probably not many of you, but just to be complete, real user measurement is essentially a technology for collecting information from the end user directly from that device. For our purposes, the way we're discussing RUM, it's the typical instrumentation using JavaScript on your website. Basically, you have a tag on your website, measurements are fired across the network in this request object or beacon, and that beacon is then collected, aggregated, and the data is then presented in a beautiful UI. The good parts of RUM, so not focusing on the bad, but focusing on the good. It's always on, right? It's always there. It's this sort of life force that's living and breathing. Every user, every single browser, a lot of breadth. Every network, really anywhere in the world, you think about sort of putting that red dye in the water. That's how I like to think about RUM. It really does persist everywhere. The other great thing about it is this ability to not just measure performance and not just measure the perceived user experience, but also capture that human behavior that's associated with performance. Things like conversion, bounce rate, user engagement. And the other thing about RUM is it's only getting better, right? I've seen a couple of talks today where we've talked about resource timing and waterfalls and all of the advancements that are being made in the browser that really give us a lot more telemetry and detail around what we can collect. So getting more and more and more complete.
So then on the synthetic side, what we really have is this idea of a consistent environment. So the key difference is that this is one data center, one computer, one node, testing, actively interrogating a website, but it's a very one-to-one kind of interaction. And the strengths and the good parts we see of that is that actually it's about the deep analysis. So there's things that you can do in synthetic that you simply can't do in RUM. Web page test is a brilliant example of that, where you're running real web browsers, and a lot of the value that comes out of web page test is through things like video capture. So it captures video at 60 frames per second, and then there's a whole lot of post-analysis that happens in that synthetic environment to create things like the start render event, speed index, build those film strips, build the video analysis. So that's one of the real key benefits of synthetic, really, is that rich data collection. The other really important thing with synthetic is that it's a clean room environment. It's a consistent baseline. And that's very, very different from the noise that we see in RUM. And that means that when you make changes to your code base and you have a clean room that's stable, that's on a stable throttled connection that is as similar as it can be over time, then when you make those changes in the code base, you see that reflected in your synthetic data. And you don't always necessarily see that in RUM depending on how noisy it is. The other key thing is that there's nothing to install, you don't need JavaScript, so you can monitor anybody and do things like competitive benchmarking.
So here's some common things that we hear, both about RUM and synthetic. So Mark and I were kind of comparing notes and what do our customers say to us a lot of times when we're presenting one number versus the other. And it's kind of interesting, it's funny because we tend to get the same questions, the same objections when we're talking about both of those technologies. So why are those numbers so completely different? I don't trust your data. Liar! They don't believe you. They think that your numbers are wrong, and to continue to interrogate you around how are you calculating this metric? What does this metric actually mean? And are you crazy? I can't share two different sets of data with my business, right? I can't have one number over here and then come up 2 weeks later and say, oh, well, look, here's how we've improved when that number is 3 times slower than that original number. So a lot of confusion that sometimes gets created when we're sharing those data points, right? So why are those numbers so far off, right? When we talk about it from the RUM perspective, we use this sort of catchy term a lot, and I like it, and we put it on a t-shirt, and it was great. But real users are not normal, right? When we look at the distribution of users with RUM, they're log normally distributed, kind of called out by that long tail that we see, which really starts to infer quite a bit of the variability that we do see in RUM. So, you were saying noise. There's a lot of things, a lot of different things that we're encapsulating and capturing when we're capturing RUM. Different dimensions, people coming from different countries, different regions, using different browsers and different devices on a different carrier, varying operating systems. So you start to get this very variable set of data. So that's why it's important to look at things like a median or percentiles to start to really, really trim that down a bit. So we've got a 3.23 second median here. 5% of the users at that 95th percentile is at 10.45 seconds. And then once you jump out to that 98th percentile, you're all the way out at 17.26 seconds. So already we can see that there's some confusion sometimes when we try to talk about those RUM numbers to maybe a consumer of data that isn't necessarily used to seeing this level of detail. And that can be driven by a lot of things. I mean, if you look at it, this is just a breakout I did to show the distribution among operating systems, and you can see how Android out here is distributed quite differently from something like Windows or Mac, where we've got much faster processors, likely connection speeds, and that type of a thing. So a lot of variability, a lot of things that go into RUM. And then you introduce synthetic into the picture. So this idea of looking at synthetic measurement with a completely cold cache, really nothing in its cache, hit the site for the first time, you've got a first synthetic measurement or synthetic first, and then you've got the synthetic repeat, which is immediately hitting that same page again and then loading up with a warm cache. So you get two different numbers already there with synthetic, and you try to look at that compared to your RUM data, and you're sort of somewhere in the middle, right? So there's quite a bit of difference there. So again, another one of those reasons that those numbers get pretty far off. And as we start to talk about synthetic, I hear this quite a bit as well, right?
That's right, and even between different synthetic environments, there's a great degree of variability as well, right? And so I get asked a lot, why is speed curve so slow? Why is your data so slow compared to either my experience or the experience that I see in RUM? And I think sometimes the thing that people forget is just the degree that we go to in synthetic to make sure that we've got a completely cold cache. Something like web page test is clearing all the DNS entries, it's clearing all the SSL connections so that it's completely as if nothing existed in the universe, and then you load a web page. And so there's a whole degree of overhead there that people are just not used to experiencing. You never experience that when you're on your computer hitting refresh constantly. And so it can just really question your perception around these numbers and where they come from. I also had a client this week that took screenshots out of 10 different synthetic monitoring services that they were doing a comparison on at the moment. And every single one of those were presenting different numbers. And they were like, why? How are we supposed to interpret all these different data coming to us with different data points? And I didn't have an answer. The only answer is really, it depends. It depends what software they're running, it depends what hardware they're running, how consistent that hardware is, what sort of throttling they're doing, where it is in the world, how it's actually doing that negotiation and content. So it's really interesting, actually, the degree of variability even within synthetic.
Yeah, and also, where are you measuring from in some cases? We had a customer that was using speed curve, and I believe that we were running a test that was actually running it from the west side of the United States, and they were sitting in Australia where their site was hosted. They're saying, I'm refreshing it and it's loading really fast. It's like less than a half a second. Meanwhile, they've got this very long response time that's coming from the United States. So they're both hitting it with a very hot browser cache and not really getting that sort of clean room environment. Plus, they're comparing numbers from very disparate geographic locations. So we created this Venn diagram kind of to be cheeky, but for the good parts, when we talk about both solutions and we talk about RUM, RUM being more of a primary source of truth when we talk about performance, the ability to look at user behavior and conversion and have this wide breadth of coverage versus synthetic that's got a lot in terms of diagnostics that we don't have in RUM, as well as the ability to look and compare things like page construction and look in environments like pre-production where you don't have users, or competitive environments where you can't measure with RUM. And really, finding that, as Steve spoiled, you really do need both, right? You need both when we talk about these two sets of data.
So one of the challenges we often face is that people go, what is the one number that I can communicate back to the organization? And the reality is that I think we're reaching a point of maturity in the performance industry where we've now got a wealth of data, right? And there is so much that we can measure, whether it comes from RUM or it comes from synthetic or it comes from APM. Like, there's a whole lot of different sources that we can use. So we're faced with this real challenge around when we decide to communicate within our teams and to the organization, what is the number that we're going to pick? And as I alluded to, this morning, like the real challenge here is, who are you talking to? And so it's very impossible to just pick one number and go, right, this is the thing that we're going to use across the organization for every single person. These numbers all mean different things to different people, and they have different questions that they're trying to ask of this data. And so when we thought about this talk and how we kind of lift the discussion out of just the technical aspects of synthetic and RUM, it's really about this idea here, is that we have a number of personas in different roles, depending on whether you're a CEO or a designer or a developer. There's actually all sorts of different things you're looking for in those dashboards and in those data sources. And by mixing those all into the one space, we create this real sense of overwhelming amount of data and metrics that are coming at us.
It's a metric fire hose of data that's just coming in there, right?
And the thing that really interests me about this is I think this is not a new thing, right? We've dealt with this in the web analytics space, where when we first started tracking web analytics, it was how many visitors have you got? How many hits? And that whole market has matured to a point where we now have dozens of attributions and where are people coming from, what are they doing, conversions. It's a very, very rich space in the web analytics space. And that has seen the rise of the web analyst as a really important role where they look at all these data sources and actually turn them into something meaningful for different people in the organisation. And I don't know about you, there's not many in New Zealand, maybe there's a few more here, but I don't know if I've actually met a performance analyst yet. Someone that actually performs this role of transforming these performance, these raw kind of metrics into something that is meaningful for the business. And I think that's the challenge that we kind of face. And so what we wanted to do with the talk today is move out of that technical space and actually pose ourselves some questions. So we've got a set of 10 questions here that we often hear in the organisation, and we've attempted to take those questions and go, where would we pull the data from? Doesn't matter if it comes from RUM or synthetic, just how are we actually going to provide a data point that creates meaning and can answer that question for a particular role. So we're going to move through the 10 questions now. While we're doing this, I'd really love you to think about what questions have you faced in the organisation that you found really challenging, where you've then looked at all the data that you've got available and gone, actually, I don't know how to answer that. I don't know where I would find the right number to answer that query that's coming to me. And if we haven't answered it in one of these 10, we're going to invite you at the end to submit some of those questions, and Cliff and I will do our best to try and answer how would we approach finding that data and bringing meaning to that question. So as an example of that, the first one here is as we've alluded to, what is the right number for me to communicate to the organisation? And even if we do a really simple mapping here and we forced ourselves to only pick one metric, we can see here that that metric would actually be really different for our different roles. If it's our CEO, it's about revenue, right? And it's about the relationship between performance and revenue and how much am I leaving on the table. If you had to pick one, that's the one that has meaning. If it's my, which was the next one?
This is an operations guy. You can't tell. I mean, come on.
Operations guy, page load.
That's right.
Front-end developer, start render. So these are related to the things that I have control over in my role. Front-end developer, it's all about those JavaScript frameworks, the CSS, what am I blocking, what's that critical path, when can I get a pixel on screen? That's the one metric that really has meaning to me. And if I'm more in the design and user experience space, then it's about how does that experience actually feel? And speed index is a really amazing and quite sophisticated calculation of when does the content feel like it's ready, that I can at least be scanning the page and reading some content and interacting with your website. So all these roles might have very different numbers that they actually have, get their meaning from to answer their different questions.
So back to that conversation about the CEO who I've portrayed here. So stereotypically with the money suit and the cigar, all he cares about is money, right? Clearly we don't know that. We know that's not quite the case, but there's some truth there, right? So how is site performance impacting my revenue? So we've heard a lot of this over velocities throughout the years, people coming, sharing their stories, talking about how they improved page speed and saw dramatic improvements to conversion. But the truth is you really have to look at your own data, and we continue to sort of say this year after year. For example, here's two different retailers, one that's focused on specialty goods, more luxury items, one that's focused on general merchandise. And what we're looking at is the correlation between bounce rate or users that basically had a single page visit. They went to the site, saw one page, and then they left, over page load time. And you see we've kind of chopped that off there at about 9.6 seconds. But you can see even there that up to about 6 seconds, they're comparable in terms of the slope, in terms of their engagement index, if you think of it that way. But after 6 seconds, that specialty goods retailer is a bit more patient than when we look at the general merchandiser. And this is even more true when we look at conversion rates, right? So here's the same type of an example, but we're looking about at a conversion rate, or users who actually placed an order on the site. Lower conversion rate overall for luxury goods as we'd expect, but much more patience, much more tolerance in terms of if they're going to buy or not, versus a general merchandiser who obviously they've got a choice, they can bail and go somewhere else, right? So the relationship between those two things I think is important to think about, because you really have to look at your own data. And not just look at your own data, but not all pages are created equally either, right? I tend to be a little bit retail heavy just because of my background and because of a lot of my customers. However, we did this study, which I thought was really interesting, where we looked at a typical e-commerce site. We said, okay, so for pages that are actually top of funnel, home page, search page, browse page, product page, what's that sensitivity level in terms of performance? At what point they start to become disengaged, and what's the slope of that line look like? And you can see, obviously, pretty impactful. So, for a top of funnel page, we see conversion rate dropped up by 50% when the browse page increases from 1 to 6 seconds. So very dramatic, very sharp drop off there, versus a bottom of funnel page where a user's checking out, and you can see obviously there's simply not the same relation. At that point, they're engaged, and yes, we obviously need to make that checkout as fast as possible. However, at that point, they're bought in a little bit more, and they don't quite have the sensitivity. So this really helps the CEO say, okay, well, where should I be prioritizing my efforts? Which product team should I be focusing on in terms of page speed and performance? And it really gets back to that one number, right? So if we take all of this and we look at the conversion rate, and we see that roughly we can equate conversion and revenue in terms of a second, right? 1 second equals $27 million, maybe annualized or something. This is the type of number that you would want to report back to that CEO. This is the type of information that he needs to understand the importance of performance. Next question.
How do we compare to the competition?
You have no bias here.
So this is quite a simplistic one, right? We're comparing and doing competitive benchmarking is pretty much the only thing you can do with synthetic, right? You can't do that in RUM because you can't run around and install JavaScript on other people's websites, unfortunately. And so Cliff and I were playing with this, and I think there's a really interesting thing here where currently I show numbers like this. So these are the start rendered numbers for a bunch of news sites. But actually, when we're thinking about that clean room environment, and we're thinking about the source of truth for an actual number, you should be getting that from RUM. And so we should actually remove all these numbers and just talk about relative measures, right? And so it completely changes the picture when you get rid of the seconds, because the seconds don't really matter when you're talking about relative competitive benchmarking. And it's really interesting to talk about the fact that you are faster or slower. And when The Guardian did their press release recently for when they launched their responsive site in the US, they didn't talk about hard numbers or anything like that. What they talked about is the fact that they were 4 times faster. And that has a lot more meaning and resonance than trying to quote specific numbers, which we're all struggling to place in our head, in our timeline that we carry around.
So this kind of brings us to another question where we've maybe applied the first two a little bit and talked a little bit about how we could answer a question like this. The original question was China, but we said, hey, we're going to Barcelona, so we're going to do this for Spain. How is our site doing in Spain, and are we winning there? A question that might come from the CEO to this performance analyst that's at a company. And really, what we tried to do here was just more visualize, simplify the view quite a bit, where what we're trying to communicate is the fact that here's a number, right? Here's Spain, and obviously we can see that Spain's not completely green, it's not completely red, it's somewhere in the middle, but also convey the importance of the competitive index here. We stripped the numbers completely from the competitive index to say, hey, right here, if we look at ourselves as this line, going across the middle, sites 1 and 2 are faster, but sites 3, 4, and 5 are much slower. So give them some positional index around, hey, this is where we stack up to the competition without, again, throwing a number at that then they have to digest and see 2 different numbers on the same screen. And also convey things that you can get from RUM, like, hey, this is really only 1% of our traffic, so does this really matter? Is this really a market that we're going into? Are we trying to expand here? What have you. But the idea here is just really to simplify, to create a view that's something that they could throw on a slide, or you could throw on a slide and give to that CEO to present to the board or whoever it might be, right?
And I think one of the challenges here is actually getting rid of the data sources. So, this is RUM plus hey, we've got a node in Spain where we're doing the competitive benchmarking from. But, hiding that and just turning it into a single view where we talk about performance as a more holistic thing.
Right. Right. Okay, big one today, right? I think Andy had a talk earlier about third parties. I've heard them mention about every talk, and we always tend to. So how are third parties impacting my site? I pulled some data, actually. I pulled some data from HP Archive a while back and did this study where I wanted to see of the top 25 retailers in the Alexa, how much of an impact does third party really have on those sites, right? So I decided to look at domains and say, request to those domains. First of all, how many domains were there? And I was kind of astonished to see that they're not necessarily following the rules here like we would expect them to. A median value of 32 domains on a page, a minimum of 25, a max of 87. But everything in red there is actually third party. So what's even more astonishing, if we pull out a specific example here, one of the top 5 retailers in that study, 91% of the domains that they were calling were from third parties, and this was basically for 68 total domains on their site. So clearly, third party is a pervasive issue, and clearly there's a lot that we need to understand and monitor there. Where this part of the data was synthetic data from web page test, and then we had this that Mike Adler presented at New York, right?
Yeah. So this was a really interesting internal tool that the Huffington Post run, where they're literally taking a baseline of their current website, then they're eliminating all the third-party requests and domains from that web page, and then they're adding them back in one at a time to see that their impact on the overall page load. And in this particular graph, we're seeing the extra requests that each domain is actually adding. So the one across the top here, the blue line, that's adding 70 odd requests just from that one domain, from that one service. And so this was a really interesting way to kind of monitor the impact of third-party performance.
Yeah. And then when you look at it on the RUM side, and I'm not going to read this, I don't expect you to, but it's there for reference, but this is an example of an SLA that we might create with RUM, which we're encouraging people to do more and more now. I was managing a lot of third-party SLAs in my last job, and one of the challenges they would always challenge the synthetic data, just as we've seen in some of the examples before. But really, now that we've got resource timing and we can actually get much more fine-grained data about that request object, there's really no reason we shouldn't be using RUM to drive these SLAs, in my opinion. So this was just an example of an extremely variable third-party ad provider. And this is for a pretty big site with quite a bit of traffic, so to see this level of variability, fortunately this wasn't something that was blocking. This was actually something that was seamless to the user experience in the end. However, these are the type of things you want to enforce when you've got the small object that's taking up to 30 seconds in some cases, right? So this is how we would use RUM to then go about and monitor those third parties using resource timing and leveraging what's in the browsers today, right? This is one for you.
How should I measure my site in pre-production? So I think that this is a really great one in terms of the relationship between RUM, which you can't really get until you're live and in your production and you've got volume of traffic coming through. So in your development cycle, what can you do?
Yeah, what do you do when you have no users, right?
Yeah, well, you use synthetic, right?
Exactly.
So like I showed this morning, this is a very simple example, but something you can do is actually point a synthetic test at your development environment right from the get-go. And this is actually a new client of mine that has started to do a complete redesign of their site and make it responsive. And you can see here that right at the beginning they set a budget and they set about stripping out as much content as they could out of their JavaScript here. And then you slowly see it start to grow again. So that idea of actually monitoring development right from the beginning. And we can see that here on the next one where we're talking about a CSS size and someone struggling to get that back down under a particular budget as well. But having that constant feedback on what's happening in pre-production, what's happening in your development cycle, so you reduce that chance of a big surprise when you turn it on in production and suddenly it's all slow.
Yeah, but you're not necessarily gating that success criteria for the release on a number or on a performance number in seconds, because one of the things I've run into when I was trying to do this before was a lot of times there's a lot of variability there that's really has nothing to do with the performance of the site in general, or there's an absence of a CDN, so there's going to be obviously less performance there. Things aren't necessarily apples to apples, but when you compare them in terms of page construction, those are things that are within your control, and those are things that you should be creating these performance budgets for. Should I optimize my site for mobile? Yes. Next question.
Duh.
What we see is interesting, and I love looking at RUM data for this one because it's really interesting to kind of look at the shapes of these curves. Here's a site that's done that. Here's a site that's optimized for mobile and tablet, and we can see that the distribution is not too far off, right? They've done a fairly good job there, and what we're focusing on more is the shapes of these histograms in terms of how they line up. So here's an example of doing it right. And yes, we've optimized for mobile, and here's a site that hasn't, right? And this is a site that happens to get quite a bit of traffic from tablet, but they're serving full site over tablet. So not necessarily the best decision when we start to look at, first of all, how much of their users are actually on tablets. Period. They should be designing for tablet, or having a separate site for that, or obviously responsive, which we'll talk about in a second. But clearly there's some problems here with the distribution, and these people aren't. So the answer is yes, obviously you should be optimizing your site for mobile. And then you look at it from the synthetic perspective, and I really like this view, right?
Yeah, and I think what we're doing here, like the last question, is that we're almost using RUM in more of a diagnostic fashion to actually understand what's happening out there with our real users in production. And then we can use synthetic to actually help with our decision-making process when we're in development. So what we're seeing here is a website, a web page being loaded multiple times. This is actually 17 times across the viewport, and we're looking at the assets and how they're changing across all those different viewports.
And the viewports for everybody are along the bottom there on the x-axis, right? So.
Yeah, so an awesomely optimized website, not.
Right. Yeah.
So what we'd hope to see is something more like the following slide, where we're actually starting to think about what are our performance breakpoints. So rather than our visual breakpoints, what sort of decisions are we making at each viewpoint about site construction and the sorts of assets that we're delivering? And on this site, you can actually see the responsive image strategy, where this site actually delivers 22 different image sizes and formats depending on the viewport width. So it's really interesting how synthetic can give us diagnostics into the development process, whereas kind of RUM is giving us diagnostics into kind of behavioral and general sort of live production of environments.
Yep. How can I determine the effectiveness of my CDN provider? One we get a lot, right? So this is a question to the audience, right? Which site here is using a CDN? Who says site A? Who says site B? The rest of you are wrong. So Steve, you're correct, right? So obviously, when we look at RUM, and this is obviously just trying to be cheeky here, but obviously we see that distribution in terms of performance much more prevalent, and we can measure that with RUM. And the nice thing that you don't necessarily need to go out and get 300 synthetic agents to tell you your geographic spread and your geographic performance when you've got users, right? You've got users in these locations that are giving you this information. So anyway, pretty basic one, pretty obvious one. I think that anyone that's been in that CDN experience before knows that RUM's a great way to really prove that value, right? Okay, so how has page construction changed over the last month, and what impact has that had on performance? I think we each have one in here, right? So this was an interesting case where we had a joint customer, and we were looking at this, and we saw obviously that the content requests here, there was a big spike, and obviously correlating that to our RUM data, right? So using our synthetic to say, yeah, something drastically changed with the page, and what impact did that have on performance, or vice versa. Page performance got horrible here for a little bit. What was driving that? Looking at synthetic to see that, obviously there was some misconfiguration here where they're adding 50 additional assets onto the page.
And we'd both love to do more work in this space, because it'd be good to see the anti-pattern to this as well, right? Where, hey, we've added a whole lot of assets, but we've done that in a way that doesn't impact on page load. So being able to understand how the construction of a site is changing and whether that actually has an impact in our RUM data or not. It'd be really interesting to relate those together in more detail.
And on sort of a separate tangent, if we think about we've had customers where the site slowed down and conversions increased. And they've looked at the data and they've said, what the hell's going on here? This just doesn't add up. It doesn't make sense. But they had launched an ad campaign that day, and it was much more heavier in terms of images, and driven a lot of traffic to the site, and there was a slowdown, but they were driving users to the site that were actually purchasing something. So I think we talked a bit about this too, the importance of annotations in this data, right? The ability to say, give some context around what was happening on this site and when and why, and hey, we did this mail drop here, or hey, we just added these 10 additional JavaScript to our site here. Being able to correlate those things along the same timeline as your RUM data is something that Mark and I are very interested in doing together, right? This is one that we get that we wanted to admit defeat on some things, right? We didn't want to say we're just awesome and you can do all things. This is one we have challenges with, to be frank, right? What is the performance of my single page web application? I think poses challenges for both synthetic and for RUM. We're working through those challenges, right? We're doing things. We are on the RUM side, auto-instrumenting XHR requests and giving you more visibility into an Angular application or that sort of thing. However, there's caveats there. If you're measuring something like an XHR request and treating that as a quote-unquote page load, that's great and it might make sense. However, if you're measuring this very fast XHR request and treating it as a page load, it might be diluting your overall number when you actually look at your page performance. So there's challenges there that we always have to work through with RUM. And I think for synthetic, there's challenges as well where you're really only able to measure that first page load, and then everything else is essentially just being measured as a service request. So missing some context around user experience, I think.
And I think the real answer here is you've got to roll your own instrumentation.
Right.
So as you make decisions about exactly how that single page app is going to work, you come up with an instrumentation kind of process as well, beacon those events back to whatever system you like, and actually roll your own dashboards.
Yeah, I think the nice thing is that the tools vendors that are there working in the RUM space are paying a lot more attention to single page applications now, and I think that the technology is there to support it. It's just about making those decisions about how do we thoughtfully go about measuring this performance and thinking about that ahead of time. I love this one. How do I know how fast my page becomes usable? So this is you, Mr. Designer.
So this brings us back to the actual user experience, and I really love this slide because we've got synthetic at the top here, and we're really easily able to see the challenges that we all face using standard browser events, right? So this is a film strip from Web Page Test. The sorts of events that we normally get are start render when the first pixel changes, and then we have a loaded event further down the timeline somewhere, like I've just sort of shortened this down. But when you look at those first few frames here, actually, I wouldn't consider this page usable till the web fonts kick in and the text renders, and then I can be scanning headlines and looking at the image. So we've got a moment here which is not instrumented in the browser or any kind of standard events. Really what we need to do is add user timing. And fortunately, with user timing, we can actually get that from both our synthetic and our RUM. And what we see along the bottom here is actually RUM data where you've got a time to first byte at the bottom and then a fully loaded, and it's actually the green, strip through the middle that has meaning to us because we've decided that that's when the page should be usable.
And I think a lot of credit goes to Pat Meenan for sort of creating this connection between RUM and synthetic, where he wants to surface the user timing data because that is a great standard metric that we can see across. So, tools vendors on the RUM side need to add support for user timing. Tools vendors on the synthetic side need to add support for user timing,
yeah.
and we can get something like this that's much more clear and means more to an organization than page load, which everyone tends to question these days. I think Buddy and Philip will be doing a great talk on death to onload or that type of topic around what are some other metrics we can look at that'll probably get into this in some more detail tomorrow.
Well, I think we're probably all guilty of being a little bit too lazy, right? And just defaulting back to the metrics that are provided to us by our tools rather than actually sitting down and actively deciding, well, when do we think the page is ready, instrumenting that, and then using that as our key metrics. So being a lot more kind of active about the decision making into what has meaning in terms of a performance number.
So at this point, we're not done, so don't clap even if you weren't going to, don't clap. But we wanted to actually put some questions out to the audience and see if there was any any types of challenges you might have had, or actually victories as well in terms of how you might have gone about this in your own organization. So we don't have handheld mics, but if you can shout, we'll repeat questions. Please don't let Steve be the only one to ask a question because it's going to be scary. So.
Yeah, and specifically the sort of questions that we're after are those tough questions that you haven't been able to answer for the organization. So, imagine those kind of roles and go, well, what can I get out of the data that we may or may not have an idea for you?
Anyone? All right.
I just wanted to pick you up on the CDN comparison, which is great, and I can see that RUM has a lot to say on this subject. However, of course, it's inferential data. You can't absolutely know unless you confirm your suspicion. So if you've got a black hole somewhere, it might be because the CDN's let me down, it might be some other thing. And if you can test that proactively with some data testing.
Okay, let me take a stab at repeating that one. So basically what you're saying is you're calling into question the fact that that might be true, and yes, RUM can tell us a lot about our CDN, but that might not be all there is to the story. You might have a black hole somewhere, you might have a carrier problem or something else that's not the CDN, and I think you're absolutely right? In general, with the question being, hey, how do I know that I'm getting value out of my CDN or whatever that question was, I just think that what we're illustrating is that RUM is a very good way to tell you that. I think the RUM's another great way to look at those other hotspots as well, right? It might be a specific carrier. It might be something where, maybe it's a region. It was kind of interesting in weather patterns too. Like we had this interesting thing when in my previous company, and there was, I think it was during Hurricane Katrina, when we'd seen all these users sort of disappear, right, and activity go, right? It's like, well, what was going on? Well, obviously natural disasters can have an impact on your RUM data as well. So yeah, good points, and I would agree with you. Okay, who else is brave? Steve.
Mr. Souders.
What resources blocking rendering?
What resources blocking rendering? I'm actually.
You mean the critical path? Like kind of how would we get insight into the critical path?
Right. So you're saying how would we measure that, or?
How would you identify it?
It's challenging, right? Let me think about that. I think that in RUM that would be, I think, maybe a little more difficult. I think we don't have a lot of things about rendering exposed to us through RUM. I don't know. Maybe that's the correlation of film strip and waterfall. Maybe there's something to be said there.
Potentially. The thing I'm hoping for is that some of you may have been aware, but a little while back in Google PageSpeed Insight, they used to have a critical rendering path explorer that was based on a custom build of Chrome. And I know that hopefully they're kind of working on actually bringing that to Chrome itself, so we can actually see what the critical rendering path is in Chrome and what's actually blocking it. And my hope is that when they release that will then end up in web page tests, and we'll actually have some good hard metrics to tell us about what it is exactly that's blocking the critical rendering path and what that dependency chain is. Because I think you're right, Steve, at the moment it's actually quite hard to get insight into actually what is kind of blocking our critical rendering path.
Do you have thoughts there? I mean, I know you've obviously played with a little bit of RUM data in your time, so.
I would do it so I think there's multiple critical paths. I think the one that's relevant for this page load will depend on the hiccups of the internet, so I would want to do RUM. Because you could do a large number of synthetic tests and look across all of them. But in both of those, I would find the stake in the sand that is rendering. That's easier to do in synthetic. For RUM, I would use DOM content loaded. And then there's always something that is the critical item. Once you remove it, something else becomes the critical item. So I would just start in RUM finding the JavaScript script or style sheet that finishes loading right before DOM content loaded. And I would say that that is the critical path item to target.
So you would find that with synthetic, but you'd measure that with RUM, right?
No, I'd find it with RUM.
Okay, okay.
Right? So in RUM, you have 1 million people, whatever, seeing the page. In RUM, you can find DOM content loaded.
Right.
You know the resource time.
Sure.
And you say, okay, and you'd have to guess at file extensions for scripts versus style sheets versus images.
Mm.
We could probably do a pretty good job. I would find the last script or style sheet that loaded closest to DOM content loaded. And I would report that back, that URL for that script or style sheet.
Mm-hmm.
Got it. Got
There you
it.
go. Add that to the feature list.
What's that?
Add that to your feature list.
Oh, well.
I already emailed it to you.
I think you did, actually. I didn't do my homework. I'm in trouble. All right. Anybody else have any questions? Any other thoughts? Yeah.
You said that synthetic measurements are problematic for single page applications. So would it make sense to use browser automation with synthetic testing? So to define a scenario and test performance of that scenario.
So the question was, we said that synthetic is problematic when measuring single page applications. Would it be, as a thought to actually use browser automation to drive synthetic or to drive RUM to measure the Ajax? I get,
To simulate user interaction with a single page app.
Yeah, I don't know. What do you think about that one? Because personally, I've gotten a lot of users who want to use our product but drive functional tests, browser automation, and use that to test internally. And I've just seen so much variability in those environments that a lot of times I think you get a lot of false positives and you get a lot of, I don't know that I would bank on that data. But that's not to say it wouldn't be the right way. I don't know if you have an opinion on that.
I think it's hard. I think sort of as we've illustrated with a couple of these questions, my preference is to get actual performance data from RUM, where you've actually got a large enough sample size to draw some meaning out of that. And for me, synthetic is much more in that diagnostic space, giving you feedback on site construction. So I think it'll be quite difficult to get enough data sets and enough insight from a scripted journey in a single page app and synthetic to actually really have meaning. So I would fall back to my previous answer, which is you've got to instrument it, which at the end of the day isn't that hard, right? You just decide, well, these are the important moments in my single page app, and then you beacon those back, and that's I think going to be much better than trying to put any other solution in it.
So we're out of time. Mark and I are going to hang out, and we'll be here obviously for the next couple of days as well. But in summary, 3 different things we want you to take away. You really do need rich sets of data that include synthetic and RUM, both, right? There really is not one number that you can go to everyone with. So obviously you have to look at what's that role need, what's the question that they're actually answering, and what are you trying to accomplish with that? Choose those numbers for the correct audience. One that I didn't throw in here is that call out for maybe there is this new role of perf analysts to go through and do this analysis and actually transform that data into something more meaningful through both design and experience with web performance. So thank you everybody for coming. I know it was the last session of the day, so appreciate it.